As his 5-year-old son drew his final breath, his mother frantically called his father 17 times. But he rejected every single one.
Any minute.
While little Lucas passed away in a hospital bed, Garrett Lawson was busy with another woman in an upscale hotel room. He felt the vibration in his pocket, saw his wife's name flash on the screen, and made the choice to ignore her. But Garrett made a terrible miscalculation. He seemed to forget who his father-in-law was,
I think you'll find
a
this
retired
confirms
federal
everything.
prosecutor who had dedicated 30 years to putting monsters behind bars.
This is impossible.
A man who never offered forgiveness, and a man who certainly never forgot. Is there anything more satisfying than seeing karma deliver the final blow? If you believe in justice getting served, please subscribe and tell us what you think in the comments. You will not want to miss how this story plays out. Here is what happened. The life support monitor went silent at 11:47 on a chilly December evening. Meredith Lawson was frozen in place inside the pediatric intensive care unit. Her hands were still tightly holding her son's tiny fingers. His warmth was already starting to fade, slipping away like the last rays of sun on a winter afternoon. She thought of 5 years of his giggles. She remembered the bedtime stories they would whisper to each other in the dark. She could almost feel his sticky kisses and see the crayon pictures he so proudly taped to the refrigerator. All of that was gone now. It all came to an end in this sterile room that smelled like antiseptic and sorrow. Lucas, her precious boy, had his father's dark hair and his great-grandmother's blue eyes. And now he was gone forever. She was no stranger to death. During her 11 years as an emergency room nurse, she had held the hands of strangers as they left this world. She had delivered heartbreaking news to families more times than she could count. She had trained herself to set aside her own emotions to do her job. But nothing on earth could have ever prepared her for this. Nothing can ready a mother for the moment her child takes their last breath. The heart monitor displayed a flat, unwavering green line. Its long, continuous beep pierced the quiet hum of the doctors making one last effort to bring him back. Dr. Robert Matthews, the cardiac specialist who had battled so fiercely for her son, took a step back from the bed. He looked at Meredith, and she could see the defeat in his expression before he even spoke. In a soft voice, he said, "Time of death, 11:47 p.m. I am truly sorry, Meredith. We did absolutely everything we could." And she knew that they had. She had seen it with her own eyes. She had even relied on her own medical training to assist. She administered medicine to her own son and performed compressions on his little chest to keep his heart beating. Simply standing by and watching would have shattered her spirit. Lucas's asthma attack had spiraled into a cardiac emergency. His small heart was already fragile from a condition he had lived with for 3 years. It simply could not handle the stress. A nurse kindly placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Lawson," she whispered, "we need to get him ready now." But Meredith was paralyzed. It felt like she could not draw a breath. She could only stare at the little face that would never again look up at her with a smile. His small chest would never again fill with air. His most cherished toy, a stuffed elephant he named Captain, lay on the pillow right next to him. He was never able to sleep without it. She had promised him that he was going to be fine. She held his hand and assured him that his daddy was coming soon. It was a lie. Where was Garrett? The question sliced through her numb grief. She had called him 17 times. 17. The phone would just ring and ring before switching to his voicemail. 17 times she had left a message, pleading with him to please answer the phone because their son was dying. She finally released Lucas's hand. Pulling her fingers away felt like ripping off a piece of herself. She stepped away from the bed and with trembling hands pulled out her phone. The screen confirmed it all. 17 calls placed to Garrett. He had ignored every single one. Her nurse's mind took over, the part of her brain that stayed clear-headed in a crisis. She scrolled right past Garrett's name and dialed the only other person who she could count on. Her father, William Sterling, picked up on the very first ring. His voice was sharp and awake, despite the late hour. "Honey, what is it?" She could only manage 3 words. 3 words that destroyed her entire world. "Lucas is gone." A short pause followed on the other end, maybe only 2 seconds long. She could practically feel him processing the information. She could picture his expression shifting from concern to anguish, and then settling into the quiet resolve she had known her whole life. "I am on my way," he stated, his voice as steady as a mountain. "Do not move. I am coming to you." He ended the call. Meredith collapsed into a plastic chair beside her son's bed. The immense gravity of her loss finally came crashing down on her. She did not weep, at least not right away. She was in a state of shock that was beyond tears, just drifting in a vast, silent emptiness. At 2:17 in the morning, Garrett Lawson finally strolled through the hospital's automatic doors. Meredith spotted him before he saw her. He walked down the corridor with the casual self-assurance of a man who is used to getting what he wants. His expensive overcoat had a light dusting of snow on it, and his polished leather shoes clicked against the linoleum floor. But something was not right. The dress shirt he wore underneath his coat was slightly rumpled. His hair was out of place, but not in a way that suggested he had been rushing. And when his eyes finally landed on her, sitting by herself in the waiting area, the look of alarm on his face seemed to arrive a moment too late. "Meredith," he began, his voice perfectly controlled. He was a man who had perfected the art of faking sincerity so well that it was nearly impossible to spot the lie. "What is happening? My battery died. I just now got your messages. I came as soon as I could." She just stared up at him. This was the man she had married 6 years ago in a sunlit garden. This was the man with whom she had made a life, a home, a son. This was the man who was absent when that son passed away. "Lucas is dead," she stated, her voice completely flat and devoid of feeling. Garrett's expression shifted, but his reactions felt off. Shock appeared, but it was a second behind schedule. Sadness flickered in his eyes, but it seemed shallow. Horror washed over his face, but it felt like a performance. Every gesture was just slightly out of sync, like a bad actor who had forgotten his lines. "What? No, that is impossible. When did this happen? How?" 3 hours ago. His heart failed. The asthma attack put too much strain on his heart. They worked on him for 45 minutes. He dropped heavily into the chair next to her. The plastic of the chair creaked beneath his frame. "I am just so sorry. I should have been here." "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." Just then, they both heard the sound of footsteps approaching down the hall. They were even, measured, and deeply familiar. Meredith looked up to see her father striding toward them. William Sterling was 68 years old, with a full head of silver hair and a face etched with the lines of a long life. He was retired from an impressive career as a federal prosecutor, having spent 30 years locking up dangerous men. He moved a bit more slowly now, but his eyes were as piercing as ever. And as he looked at Garrett, a cold fire ignited in their depths. William said nothing at all. His gaze simply fell on Garrett's rumpled shirt collar. Then his eyes zeroed in on a faint smear of lipstick on his cuff that Garrett himself had failed to see. He could smell the man's deceit like it was a cheap cologne. He walked right past Garrett and wrapped his daughter in a strong embrace. He just held her as she finally began to sob. Garrett watched the two of them, his own face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. He had never cared for his father-in-law. "He is too nosy," he would often complain. "He is always trying to be in charge. He does not trust me." As it turned out, William had very good reasons for his distrust. But Garrett was completely unaware that his life was about to be systematically dismantled. He had no clue that the man holding his grieving wife was already thinking, already strategizing. He was already preparing to tear down everything that Garrett had ever built. A silent war began that night in the sterile, brightly lit corridor of a hospital over the memory of a 5-year-old boy who deserved a far better father. The funeral took place on a bleak Tuesday morning. The sky was heavy with dark clouds that threatened to release either snow or just more sorrow. St. Michael's Church was packed with mourners. Meredith's colleagues from the hospital were there, along with neighbors from their affluent suburb, and Garrett's business associates dressed in their somber, expensive suits. The small white coffin was positioned at the front of the church, draped in a blanket of white roses. It looked impossibly small in the vast, silent sanctuary. Meredith stood between her father and her husband, dressed in black. Her face was a rigid mask of grief. She had not slept for 4 days. Every time she shut her eyes, she saw Lucas's face. Every time the house fell silent, she could hear the drone of the flatlining heart monitor. Garrett, however, played the part of the devastated father to perfection. He solemnly shook hands and accepted condolences with eyes that were expertly saddened. He delivered a eulogy for his son that brought strangers to tears, his voice cracking with emotion at all the right moments. His grief was a carefully staged performance for the audience. Lucas was obsessed with dinosaurs, Garrett said from the pulpit, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. He would stomp around the house for hours, making roaring noises, pretending he was a huge T-Rex. And every single night, he would look up at me with those big blue eyes and say, "I love you, Daddy." As she listened to Garrett speak, Meredith wondered if he was telling the truth about anything. Had he ever truly seen their son? Or was Lucas just another perfect part of his perfect world? During the funeral, she noticed Garrett check his watch, not once, but 2 separate times. She saw him glance at a text message and almost crack a smile before remembering where he was. At the cemetery, a gentle snow started to fall, covering the small casket as it was lowered into the cold ground. Meredith's hand shook as she let a single white rose fall into the grave. "Goodbye, my sweet boy," she whispered. "Mommy will love you forever." Garrett stood right beside her. He put an arm around her waist, but it felt staged, like a pose for a camera, not a gesture of comfort. The second the service was over, he looked at his watch again. Later, back at their large home on Beacon Hill, friends and family filled the beautiful rooms. Their soft voices and the catered food were supposed to be a comfort. But Meredith felt like a ghost, drifting through the crowd, accepting hugs she could not feel and answering questions she could not truly hear. Her best friend from college, Brooke Chambers, found her in the kitchen, just staring out the window at the falling snow. "How are you doing?" Brooke asked gently, her voice filled with care. She was a lovely woman of 33, with kind eyes and warm, reddish-brown hair. For 15 years, she was the only person, other than Meredith's father, William, that Meredith trusted with her whole heart. "I do not know how to answer that question," Meredith said. "I feel like someone reached inside me, took everything out, and just left an empty space." Brooke put a comforting arm around her shoulder. "Whatever you need, I am here for you, anytime, day or night. You know that, do you not?" "I do." After some time, the final guest finally went home. The catering staff packed their things and left. A deep quiet settled over the entire house. Garrett loosened his tie and grabbed his overcoat. I need to go into the office, he said, already walking toward the door. A huge deal is about to happen, and I need to be there for it. Meredith could only look at him, completely shocked. We just buried our son today, Garrett. And this is my way of dealing with it, he replied sharply, by going to work. He put on his very expensive cashmere coat, fixing the collar as he looked in the hall mirror. I will be home very late. Please do not wait up for me. He was out the door before she could say another thing. In that quiet moment, something inside of Meredith finally snapped. It was a small, quiet break, like the first crack appearing on a frozen lake. She did not cry. She did not yell. Instead, a cold feeling of determination washed over her. She grabbed her own coat and went after him. Garrett's Mercedes drove smoothly out of the driveway, heading for downtown Boston. Meredith followed in her own car, staying far enough behind, her heart pounding inside her chest. She thought he would drive to the financial district, to the tall, shiny building where his company, Whitmore Capital, had its offices. But that is not where he went. Instead, he drove toward the harbor, to the very luxurious Pemberton Hotel. Meredith found a place to park across the street and simply watched. She saw him give his keys to the valet. She saw him walk through the hotel's large, fancy entrance like a man who had been there many times before. She waited for 5 minutes. Then she got out of her car and walked into the hotel herself. The man working at the front desk did not even seem to see her. In her dark dress from the funeral, she was like a shadow, just one more sad person, looking for a quiet place to sit. She chose a small table in the hotel bar that had a perfect view of the elevators. At 7:43, the elevator doors opened and Garrett walked out with a woman. She was small and very stylish, probably in her early 30s. Her blonde hair was done perfectly, her dress was clearly from a designer, and her jewelry was elegant and expensive. She held onto Garrett's arm in a comfortable, familiar way that said everything. They stopped close to the elevators, and Garrett leaned down to whisper something to her. The woman laughed, a bright, clear sound that sliced through the quiet of the lobby. Meredith lifted her phone and began taking pictures. 1, 2, 3. Each quiet click of the camera felt like a tiny piece of justice. The woman gave Garrett a fast kiss on the cheek, then got back on an elevator by herself. Garrett stood there for a second, a little smile on his face as he watched the door slide shut. Then he turned around and walked into the hotel restaurant, likely for the fake business meeting he had made up. Meredith stayed at her table for another 20 minutes. Her hands were perfectly still as she held a glass of water that she never drank. The small crack that had formed inside her had now completely shattered. In its place, something new was rising up, a feeling she had not experienced in many years. It was pure rage, but it was not a hot, fiery anger. It was a cold, calculating rage, the kind of rage that is patient, that observes, and that makes very detailed plans. As she drove home through the snow, the pictures on her phone felt like proof of a horrible crime, and she realized that is exactly what it was. It was a crime against her heart. It was a betrayal so painful it made every other problem in her life seem insignificant. When she walked back into her house, she saw her father, William, waiting for her in the living room. "Where did you go?" he asked. Then he saw the expression on her face. "You followed him." His eyes became narrow. "What did you discover?" Meredith did not speak. She simply gave him her phone, showing him the pictures on the screen. William looked at every single photo, his face growing colder and harder with each one. "How long have you thought something was wrong?" he asked. "For months, I guess. Maybe even longer. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid." She fell onto the couch, suddenly feeling a huge wave of exhaustion. "I was so foolish." "No," William said, sitting down next to her, his voice strong. "He made you feel that way. That is what men like him are good at. They convince you that you are the crazy one for trusting your own feelings. What am I supposed to do now? William was silent for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was as cold as the winter air outside. Now, we find out everything about who your husband really is, and after that, we will make him pay for it. 3 days after the funeral, Meredith was at her father's kitchen table in Cambridge. She was surrounded by papers that showed her entire marriage in the form of cold numbers and unbelievable lies. William had been making many calls. He had reached out to old friends from his time as a prosecutor, people who owed him favors. These were experts at finding the secrets that powerful men try to keep hidden. A forensic accountant named Margaret Foster had been working for 2 full days, carefully uncovering the tangled mess of Garrett Lawson's secret financial world. What she discovered made Meredith feel sick to her stomach. "He forged your signature," Margaret said, putting documents on the table like a surgeon arranging her tools. "And he did not just do it one time. It was not only for the deed to your home." She put down more and more stacks of paper. "Here are 3 different loan applications, for a total of more than $200,000. Here's a second mortgage he took out on the house. And here are the credit cards he opened using your name, with a total balance of $93,000. Meredith just looked at the papers. She could see her own signature, perfectly copied, on papers she had never seen before in her life. Her social security number, her job information, all of it was used without her knowing. "How could that happen? I would have seen the statements." "He opened a secret post office box," Margaret explained. "It was located in Somerville. He had all the bills sent there, so you would never find out." William's jaw was clenched in pure anger. "There is more," Margaret said. She opened a different file, this one full of papers, with red flags on them. "These are insurance policies, health and life insurance for your family." She pointed to one specific line. "Garrett let Lucas's health insurance expire 4 months ago. He simply stopped paying for it. He needed the money to pay for his gambling losses." The room began to spin around Meredith. She grabbed the side of the table to keep herself steady. "Gambling?" "Online poker. Betting on sports. Horse races." Margaret's voice was soft, but her words felt like sharp knives. "Based on what we have found, Garrett Lawson owes at least $300,000 to different bookies and gambling sites. I had no idea. He never said a word about it. I never saw anything to suggest it." "They become very skilled at hiding it," Margaret said, "especially men from wealthy families who have a reputation to maintain. They use secret email addresses, disposable phones, and sometimes whole separate lives." Meredith looked at her father, her eyes stinging with tears that she would not allow to fall. "Lucas did not have any insurance when he died. He died because his father had a gambling problem." William nodded his head slowly, his face like a statue carved from stone. "The night Lucas passed away, about 3 hours before Garrett met his mistress, he was at a casino in Atlantic City. He purchased $12,000 in chips. He lost every single dollar at the blackjack table. Then he drove back to Boston, met that woman at the Pemberton Hotel, and turned off his phone." A deep, total silence hung in the room after he was done speaking. Meredith jumped to her feet, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. She walked over to the window and looked out at the peaceful Cambridge street. A light snow covered the trees, and the world outside was having a completely normal day. "I want him in prison," she said. Her voice was perfectly calm, as cold as the wind blowing outside. "I want his mother's bank accounts frozen. I want his mistress's life completely destroyed. I want every single person who helped him hide all of this to lose everything they have." William stood up and came to her side. "Then we will do this the smart way." We cannot let our feelings control us right now. This has to be about pure strategy and cold, careful planning. Meredith turned away from the window and finally looked right at him. So, who was she? The other woman's name was Sloane Whitmore. She was 31 years old and worked as a senior analyst at her father's company, Whitmore Capital. The founder's daughter, of course. A humorless laugh escaped Meredith's lips. It figured. Garrett always did have expensive taste. William leaned forward, his voice gentle. There is something more you need to know. Sloane was not the only one. My investigation found 3 other women. A woman named Nicole Brennan back in 2016, then Cassandra Wells in 2019, and one more woman who would not give us her name. Eleanor Lawson paid them all. They were forced to sign agreements, promising they would never speak a word about what happened, and after that, they vanished. Meredith absorbed this new information, another layer of deceit piled on a mountain of betrayal. 3 other women had come before the mistress. 3 women had been paid for their silence. Garrett had destroyed their lives, and his mother just wrote a check to make the entire problem disappear. I have to talk to them, Meredith said, her voice firm. I want to meet Nicole and Cassandra. I need to hear their stories in their own words. I can make that happen. Just then, a soft knock at the kitchen door interrupted their conversation. William's housekeeper stood in the doorway. Mr. Sterling, a woman is here asking for Mrs. Lawson. She says her name is Brooke Chambers. A wave of pure relief washed over Meredith. It was Brooke, her absolute best friend. She was the single person in the world Meredith knew she could trust completely. Please, show her in. A moment later, Brooke rushed into the room, her face a mask of worry. She went straight to Meredith, wrapping her in a long, comforting hug. I got here as soon as I heard, Brooke said, holding her tight. I have been so worried sick about you. You have not been answering any of my calls. I have been a bit preoccupied. Brooke's gaze swept across the room. She took in the stacks of documents on the table, the overflowing folders, and the grim look on William's face. What is all of this? This is evidence, Meredith replied. Against my husband? Evidence of what? And so, Meredith told her absolutely everything. She laid out the details of the affair, the secret gambling addiction, the falsified documents, and the life insurance policy he had canceled. She did not leave out a single, painful detail. Brooke listened to the entire story, a look of pure horror spreading across her face. Her hand flew to her mouth as her eyes widened in disbelief. Oh my goodness, she whispered, after Meredith had finished. Meredith, I had no idea. I am so incredibly sorry. No one knew, Meredith said quietly. He was an expert at keeping his secrets hidden. What are you planning to do now? Meredith looked at her father, then met her best friend's eyes. We are going to ruin him. Brooke nodded slowly, her expression hardening with resolve. Whatever you need, I am with you, always. That night, hours after Brooke had gone home, Meredith was lying wide awake in her father's guest room. She could not stop playing their conversation over and over in her head. She was looking for something that just did not sit right. It was nothing she could name specifically. It was just a strange flicker she saw in Brooke's eyes when she mentioned the evidence. There was a split second of hesitation before Brooke said all the right, supportive things. Meredith told herself she was just being paranoid. Brooke was her best friend. She was the one person she trusted above all others. Brooke would never, ever betray her. Meredith squeezed her eyes shut, praying for sleep to finally come. She forced the doubt from her thoughts, completely unaware of how terribly wrong she was. 2 weeks passed after the funeral. For the first time since she had followed Garrett to that hotel, Meredith returned to their townhouse on Beacon Hill. She had been staying with her father in Cambridge, carefully gathering proof and creating a strategy. She was building a legal case so airtight that not even Eleanor Lawson's vast fortune could break it. But she was here tonight for a very particular purpose. She had to get certain papers from the house. She needed Garrett's private files and the financial records he believed were securely locked away in a hidden safe behind a painting in his office. She knew the combination to the safe. She had known it for many years. Garrett had told her the numbers early in their marriage. That was back in the days when he thought she was too naive to ever understand what the documents actually meant. He had never bothered to change the combination. The house was completely dark when she pulled up. Garrett's Mercedes was missing from the driveway. She let herself in with her own key and moved silently through the halls that she once considered home. Every object she saw triggered a painful memory. Meredith saw Lucas's tiny handprints still smudged on the window. His toy dinosaurs were still lying on the living room floor. His small rain boots were sitting right by the front door. They were waiting for his little feet, but he would never come to wear them again. Meredith shook the image from her mind and made herself concentrate. She could not let herself fall apart now. The study looked exactly as she had left it. The same leather armchairs were there, along with the huge mahogany desk. The old oil painting still hung over the fireplace, hiding the wall safe. She pushed the painting aside and carefully dialed in the numbers. The safe door clicked open quietly. Inside, she found stacks of documents, bank statements, and investment portfolio records. A folder with the word personal written on it made her heart pound in her chest. She worked with urgency, putting everything from the safe into her large tote bag. She was so focused on her mission that she never heard the front door creak open. "What in the world do you think you are doing?" a voice demanded. She whipped around to see Garrett standing in the entrance to the study. His face was twisted in a mask of pure rage. From the shadows behind him, his mother, Eleanor Lawson, emerged. Meredith had always been terrified of Eleanor. At 67 years old, Garrett's mother radiated an intimidating power that came from generations of Boston wealth. Her silver hair was styled perfectly. Her designer suit was immaculate, and her eyes were as cold as chips of ice. "We had a suspicion you might show up here," Eleanor said, her voice unnervingly calm. "I told Garrett you would probably try to get your hands on this evidence. Grief can make people so predictable." Garrett marched across the room and violently snatched the bag from Meredith's shoulder. He turned it upside down, dumping everything onto his desk. He shuffled through the documents with furious, desperate movements. "Are you searching for something in particular?" he sneered. His voice was dripping with venom. "Perhaps some bank records? Proof of my other women? Evidence that I am not the perfect husband you pretended I was?" "You let our son die," Meredith shot back. Her voice was steady, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "You got rid of his insurance policy. You gambled away all the money for his medical treatments. Lucas died without insurance, all because of you." Garrett's jaw clenched. "Lucas died because he was sick." He snarled. "He was always sick. He died because you were so stubborn about keeping him at home. You should have put him in a special facility where he could have been cared for by professionals." The cruelty of his words hit her like a punch to the stomach. "You cannot possibly believe that," she whispered. "What I believe," Garrett said, taking a step toward her, "is that you are an unstable woman. You cannot accept that sometimes children get sick and pass away. So instead of mourning like a normal mother, you have to find a villain. You are just looking for someone to punish." Eleanor moved to stand next to her son. They presented a solid wall against their shared problem. "Meredith, my dear, I know you are hurting. We are all hurting. Lucas was my grandson, you know. But this," she waved a dismissive hand at the papers scattered on the desk, "this is not the answer. This will not bring him back. It will only shatter what is left of our family. There is no family left to shatter, Meredith stated. There is only me and him and the truth of what he did. Eleanor's fake smile dissolved, and her face turned to stone. The truth is whatever I decide it is, and I have more than enough money and influence to make certain that my version of events is the only one anyone ever hears. She took a folder out of her designer purse and placed it on the desk. Everything is now in Garrett's name, Eleanor stated. The house, the stock accounts, the retirement money, all of it. You signed the transfer documents yourself 18 months ago. I have the original copies right here, all legally witnessed and notarized. A cold wave of dread washed over Meredith. I never signed any papers like that. Of course you did, Eleanor said, her smile absolutely terrifying. You were bone-tired after working a double shift at the hospital. Lucas had been sick the entire week. Garrett came home with a stack of papers. He told you they were just some routine updates for your will and finances, and you signed every one of them without reading a single line. It happens to people more than you would think. In a flash, Meredith remembered that exact night. She remembered being so exhausted she could barely see straight. She remembered a thick pile of papers. She remembered Garrett's soothing voice telling her, "Just sign, right here, and one last time, right here." You forged my signature, Meredith accused her. I did no such thing. Your signature is on every single page. Any judge in America will confirm that they are perfectly legal. Eleanor leaned in closer, and her strong, expensive perfume was suffocating. Her smile was as sharp as a razor's edge. If you try to divorce my son, you will leave this marriage with nothing. You will have nothing but debt and the memory of your child. But if you try to fight us, we will utterly destroy you. We will see to it that your nursing license is taken away. Your finances will be destroyed. Your reputation will be utterly ruined. She paused for a moment. And so will the reputation of your father. A cold chill ran through Meredith's entire body. What in the world could my father possibly have to do with this? William Sterling served as a prosecutor for a very long time. For 30 years, his job was to put criminals behind bars. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Some of those cases were not handled strictly by the rules. I have paperwork. I have people who are ready to testify. I have evidence that could force those cases to be reopened. It would end careers. It could put an old man in jail for misusing his authority as a prosecutor. You are lying, Meredith managed to get out. Am I, though? Eleanor smoothed the front of her suit jacket. You can certainly take that chance and find out. But I am giving you my word, Meredith. If you keep going down this road, you are going to lose absolutely everything, and your father will die inside a prison cell. She turned and started walking to the door, but then she stopped. Go home. Mourn your son. Take the money that we are offering you, and start a new life somewhere else. Her voice suddenly sounded soft, almost like a concerned mother. It is truly the smartest decision you could possibly make. And just like that, she was gone. Garrett walked out right after her, without saying another word. Meredith was left standing by herself in the study. She was completely surrounded by all the proof she had collected. Proof that now seemed completely and utterly useless. Her hands began to tremble, and her heart started to pound in her chest. But deep inside, underneath all the fear, a different feeling began to surface. They had made a huge mistake in judging her. They thought she would crumble under the pressure. They were sure that their threats would make her hide in a corner. They were completely wrong. 3 weeks after the funeral, Meredith arranged a meeting with Nicole Brennan. They chose a quiet little coffee shop in Hartford, Connecticut, a place far removed from the difficult memories of Boston. Nicole, who was now 35 years old, was a soft-spoken woman with a weary look in her eyes. Her face told the story of someone who had been taught life's lessons in a very painful way. She was only 27 when Garrett first set his sights on her. Back then, she was young and full of ambition, working hard to make a name for herself in the world of finance, which was mostly run by men. He made me feel like I was the most amazing person he had ever met, Nicole said. She held a mug of tea between her hands, but had not taken a single sip. He behaved as if I was the only person who really understood him. He told me his marriage was a complete lie. He promised me he was going to leave his wife and that he and I were going to have a future together. How long did that last? Meredith asked. 8 months, Nicole replied with a humorless laugh. It went on until I found out he was seeing 2 other women at the same time. I was so foolish. I really thought I was important to him. I was convinced that what we had was real. What did he do when you tried to end things? Nicole's face suddenly grew dark. He told me he would ruin my career. He promised he would make certain I never got another job in finance. He threatened to tell everyone that I was not mentally stable, that I was the one who had chased after him, and that I was a risk for any company that was considering hiring me. Then his mother, Eleanor, came to me and offered me $50,000 to sign an agreement to never speak about it and to just go away. I was terrified. I felt like I did not have any other choice. Nicole finally raised her head and her eyes connected with Meredith's. I have regretted that decision every single day of my life. Meredith reached her hand across the table and gently placed it on top of Nicole's. Did you save anything? Any kind of proof at all? Nicole stayed quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then she opened her purse and took out a very small flash drive. I saved everything, she said in a low voice. Emails, text messages, pictures. I even have some financial papers that Garrett foolishly let me see when he was trying to show off. She placed the tiny drive into the palm of Meredith's hand. For 8 years, I have hoped that someone with enough bravery would finally be able to use this. The information on Nicole's flash drive changed the entire situation. Meredith took that information and added it to the proof that Margaret Foster had already discovered. Together, it created a terrible and clear account of Garrett Lawson's illegal activities. It included proof of faking documents, committing fraud, and even hiding money through secret bank accounts that Eleanor had set up in other countries. The evidence showed a history of avoiding taxes and taking advantage of people that went back almost 10 years. Meredith took everything she had found to the district attorney's office. Richard Sullivan, the lawyer who was given her case, was a serious man in his 50s. He was known for successfully prosecuting powerful people who committed financial crimes. "This is very convincing," Sullivan said, while he looked over the papers on his desk. The charges for faking documents alone could send him to prison for several years. When you add the money-related crimes, the history of mistreatment, and the stories from other victims, he looked up at Meredith. "We can definitely put together a very powerful case." For the very first time since Lucas had passed away, Meredith felt a small spark of hope. She called Brooke to tell her the wonderful news, and they made plans to meet at a wine bar in the neighborhood where they used to live. Brooke listened and showed the perfect amount of excitement. She asked smart questions about the evidence, the legal process, and what the prosecutor planned to do. "This is just wonderful," Brooke said as she reached her hand across the table and gave Meredith's a gentle squeeze. "He is finally going to be held responsible for his actions." Meredith replied, "I could not have gotten this far without you. You have been my support through all of this." Brooke gave her a warm smile. "That is what friends are for For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, a true smile spread across Meredith's face. She leaned closer to her friend and said, "I found another one of his victims, Brooke. Her name is Cassandra Wells." Meredith continued, explaining that Cassandra had the original papers with Garrett's actual signature on them. It was solid proof that would be impossible for him to deny in a courtroom. Brooke's eyes grew wide with surprise. "That is incredible," she said. "Where is she living now?" "She is in Cambridge. I have a meeting with her tomorrow." A slight look of concern seemed to appear on Brooke's face. "You need to be very careful," she warned. "Eleanor has people watching and listening all over the city. She might try to reach Cassandra before you can." "I will be," Meredith promised. But when she arrived at Cassandra Wells's apartment the next day, it was already too late. The apartment was completely empty. The landlord told her that Cassandra had packed up all of her belongings and left very early that morning. She did not provide a new address or any reason for leaving so suddenly. She had simply vanished without a trace. 3 days later, Meredith received news that turned her world upside down. Richard Sullivan, her lawyer, called her into his office. He had a very grave look on his face. "We have a huge problem," he said to her. "The proof that your father's contacts gave us has been thrown out. A judge decided that the evidence had not been collected in the proper way. Without that proof, their entire case was now extremely weak." Meredith felt as if all the blood had drained from her face. "What is the name of the judge?" she asked. He answered, "Judge Richard Blackwell." The name hit Meredith like a punch to the stomach. Blackwell was one of Eleanor's closest and most loyal friends. He was a man who had eaten dinner at the Lawson family home for many, many years. "There is something else," Sullivan said, with a bit of reluctance. "Garrett has filed a legal case against you. He is saying that you are not thinking clearly because of your sadness. He was also trying to get a court order to keep her away from him, and he had someone who would testify to support his claims." "A witness to what?" Meredith asked, completely bewildered. Sullivan slid a piece of paper across the desk toward her. It was an official statement made under oath. It claimed that Meredith had made threats to kill Garrett. At the very bottom of the page was a signature, Brooke Chambers. The room started to feel like it was spinning. Meredith held onto the side of the desk to stop herself from collapsing as her vision became fuzzy. Brooke, the person who had been her best friend for 15 years, the one person she had trusted with her most private thoughts and fears. She had been secretly working for Eleanor this whole time. "I never made a threat against anyone," Meredith said, her voice barely a whisper. "Brooke is inventing this story. She is lying." "I believe you," Sullivan said softly, "but this makes everything much more complicated for us." That night, Meredith drove to Brooke's apartment to confront her. She did not bother to ring the doorbell. She used the spare key that Brooke had given her many years ago, insisting that she should have it. She walked in and went directly to the living room. Brooke was sitting on the sofa with a glass of wine in her hand. Tears were streaming down her face. "How long has this been going on?" Meredith asked. Brooke didn't even try to pretend she was confused. 3 years, she admitted. "Why?" "Eleanor is the one who pays for my mother to stay in a nursing home. I did not have enough money to pay for it myself." Brooke started to cry uncontrollably. "I never thought things would go this far. I never thought—" Her words trailed off. "Meredith, I am so deeply sorry. The last thing I ever wanted to do was hurt you." "My son is gone," Meredith said, her voice cold and without any emotion. "And you are helping the man who let him die." I know," Brooke cried, trying to reach for her. "Please, you have to understand." "Get out of my life." Meredith's voice was as cold as a winter storm. And you can let Eleanor know that this fight is not finished. She turned sharply and walked out of the apartment into the cold night air. She was now truly by herself, betrayed by the person she trusted most, and her legal options were in ruins. But she was not giving up. Not yet. The first of Eleanor's threats became real 2 days after she learned about Brooke's betrayal. Meredith was at her father's kitchen table, staring down into a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The doorbell rang. Her father, William, got up to see who it was. He returned with a large brown envelope in his hand. It had the official stamp of the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Nursing. She knew what it was before she even opened it. Someone had filed anonymous complaints against her. The reports accused her of neglecting patients, being emotionally unstable, and even stealing drugs. Each lie was described in painstaking detail, with specific dates and case numbers for things that never even happened. Her nursing license was suspended while they investigated. She was now legally forbidden from working as a nurse until this mess was cleared up. "This has Eleanor's fingerprints all over it," William said, his voice low and serious as he read the official letter over her shoulder. "She is trying to destroy your life, piece by piece. Your job, your friends, and your good name." And just like that, her entire career vanished. Meredith looked down at her own 2 hands. For 11 years, these hands had saved people's lives. They were the very same hands that had held her son when he took his final breath. But now, she was not even allowed to care for a patient. "What am I supposed to do now?" she whispered. "We're going to fight," he replied. "We will prove that every single one of these claims is a total fabrication." But even as he said the words, Meredith could see the doubt in his eyes. Eleanor had far too much money and too many influential friends. They didn't stand a chance against her connections. All Meredith could think about were the patients she would now never be able to help. She thought of her coworkers, who would undoubtedly hear the awful rumors and begin to doubt her. A whole career, built with care over 11 years, was gone in an instant. It was all taken away by a woman who had never had to work for anything in her life. That evening, Garrett had flowers delivered to her father's house. They were white lilies, the kind you see at a funeral. The card read, "Thinking of you during this difficult time." Meredith threw them straight into the garbage can. A week later, the second disaster struck. For a few days, she had not been feeling right. She felt sick every single morning, and a deep tiredness settled in her bones that was more than just grief. She tried to tell herself it was only the stress of everything happening. She told herself it was anything but the one thing she was too afraid to even consider. But the body always tells the truth. She was sitting on the cold tile of the bathroom floor at 6 in the morning, looking at a positive pregnancy test. She was 8 weeks pregnant. The baby was conceived before Lucas had died, and before she discovered Garrett's true nature. It was before her entire world fell apart. She was carrying Garrett's child. There was no getting away from him now. She put a hand on her belly and felt a cold wave of terror wash over her. How could she ever bring a child into this living nightmare? How could she look at this baby's face every day without seeing Garrett's cruel eyes looking back? She told only her father, William. "This changes everything," he said in a quiet voice as they sat at the kitchen table. "You have to understand that Garrett will use this baby to hurt you." "I know," she replied. "So, what are your plans?" Meredith stared out the window at the gray February sky. What did she want? She wanted her son, Lucas, to be alive again. She wanted to wake up and find out that the last 3 months had just been one long, horrible dream. But wishing does not make things real. "I am keeping the baby," she finally said. "I can't punish an innocent child for what Garrett has done." William gave a slow nod. In that case, we will handle this together. He was right about Garrett. A few days later, his attorneys filed a request for custody of the unborn child. Their case was brutal. They argued that Meredith was mentally unwell, using the complaints to the nursing board as their evidence. They pointed out that she was jobless and living with her elderly father. Garrett, in contrast, was a successful businessman who could provide a safe and stable home. The family court judge, who just so happened to be one of Eleanor's close friends, granted Garrett visitation rights. He was permitted to see the child 3 days a week, starting on the day of its birth. He would also get a say in all the big decisions. He would be a permanent part of her life. After the court session, Meredith sat by herself in the empty courthouse hallway. She held her hands on her stomach as the reality of the trap closed in around her. She could not escape. She could not hide. She was now legally bound to Garrett Lawson for the next 18 years, trapped by the courts, trapped by blood, and trapped by the new life that was growing inside of her. The third disaster came 3 weeks later. Meredith was in the kitchen preparing some tea when she heard a sudden, loud crash. It was a heavy sound, like a body collapsing to the floor, followed by a choked gasp, and then a dreadful silence. She ran into the living room. William was lying on the floor beside his favorite chair. His face was a sickly gray color, and his hand was grabbing at his chest. His eyes were wide with pain and fear. His mouth was moving, but no words were coming out. "Dad!" she cried, falling to her knees next to him. Her nursing instincts took over, even as pure panic flooded her system. "Look at me. Please just stay with me," she begged, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. She tried hard to keep her voice calm. She knew exactly what was happening. He was having a major heart attack. The ambulance arrived in just 7 minutes. Meredith went to the hospital with her father, holding his hand tightly the entire way. She kept promising him that he would be fine. She told him over and over how much she needed him. She pleaded with him not to leave her alone. The medical team rushed him into emergency surgery. The hours crawled by as Meredith sat in the waiting area, pregnant and completely terrified. She found herself praying to a God she no longer believed in. He made it through the operation, but the man who woke up 3 days later was not the same strong father who had vowed to help her fight. William was fragile now, a mere shadow of the person he used to be. His voice was faint, and all of his movements were slow. The long fight had already cost him years of his life. The heart attack had taken away whatever strength he had left. "I am so very sorry," he whispered, as she sat next to his hospital bed, holding his delicate hand. "I brought this all down on you. That old case, the corners I cut 30 years ago, and now it is destroying you." "Did you plant the evidence?" she asked him directly. "No," he answered, closing his eyes. "But I didn't fight hard enough when they buried important facts. I let it happen because I was so certain the man was guilty." A single tear rolled down his wrinkled cheek. And that was all the opening they needed to twist the story. Meredith looked at her father, the man who had always been her hero, her solid ground. He was now old and broken, too weak to see this fight to the end. She was now completely and utterly on her own. That night, she sat in Lucas's dark room, holding his favorite stuffed animal, Captain the Elephant. She whispered to her son in the quiet, "I tried, my darling boy. I really did. But they have everything. They have the money, the influence, and they even own the judges. They have made all of my friends turn their backs on me." She pressed her face into the toy, trying to breathe in the last trace of Lucas's scent that remained. "What am I supposed to do now?" The house was completely silent. Her father was in the hospital. Garrett was walking around a free man. Eleanor had gotten her way. Everything she had been trying to protect was now lost. But just as she felt despair was about to swallow her whole, something else started to move inside her. It was not the baby. It was something much older and much fiercer. It was the one part of her that refused to give up, even when everything else was gone. If she could not win against them in a courtroom, she would win in the court of public opinion. If she could not beat them with legal proof, she would beat them with the plain truth. If she could not win with power, she would have to invent a new way. She understood that the only way to win was to expose him, but she could not do it by herself. She needed an ally, someone who was already on the inside of Garrett's world, someone who knew where all the bodies were buried, and someone who had absolutely nothing more to lose. She had to find his mistress. Finding Sloane Whitmore was the simple part, but working up the nerve to actually face her was an entirely different matter. Meredith stood on the sidewalk outside the Whitmore Capitol building on a bitter, cold February night. Her breath formed a cloud in the frigid air, and her hands were buried in her coat pockets. She was 5 months pregnant, and her small baby bump was just beginning to show. The baby gave a soft kick. It was a small reminder that life continues, even when your own world has been torn to pieces. Sloane walked out of the building at 6:45. Her blonde hair shined under the streetlights. Her designer coat was perfect, and her makeup was flawless. She was everything that Meredith was not: polished, self-assured, and seemingly unharmed by life. Meredith stepped forward to block her path. Sloane stopped, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Mrs. Lawson, I need to speak with you. I have nothing to say to you." "Then you can just listen," Meredith said, pulling a large folder out of her bag. "I know everything about Nicole Brennan. I know about Cassandra Vanderwall. I even know about the other woman who was too afraid to tell me her name. That is 3 women who came before you. 3 women who Garrett promised the very same things that he is now promising you. And 3 women that his mother, Eleanor, gave a lot of money to so they would disappear." Sloane's expression became a cold, hard mask. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Yes, you do," Meredith insisted. She opened the folder, showing photos, legal papers, and signed statements. Nicole was 27. He told her that his marriage was just for show. He promised they would have a real future together. 8 months later, he threatened to ruin her career if she did not get out of his life. That is not true. There was a woman named Cassandra. She was only 25 years old. He told her the same things he told you, made the same promises, and used the same threats when she started causing trouble. Meredith looked directly into Sloane's eyes. "You are not special here. You are not different from the others. You are simply the next woman in a very long line." A small crack formed in Sloane's perfect facade, just large enough for Meredith to see the fear underneath. "Why are you telling me all this?" "Because you were with him on the night my son passed away. You heard his phone ringing. You saw him ignore my calls. I called him 17 times. 17. And he made the choice to stay with you instead of coming to help his child, who was dying." Sloane's face lost all of its color. "He told me you were just overreacting. He made it seem like your son was sick all the time and that you were just being overly dramatic." "Lucas died at 11:47 that night. He passed away while Garrett was in your bed. He died while I held his small hand, promising him that his daddy would be there any second." Meredith's voice finally broke with emotion. "Did he tell you about that part? Did he tell you that our 5-year-old son's last words were a question asking for his father?" Sloane started to shake, her calm composure completely falling apart. "No," she whispered. "He did not tell me that." "Of course he did not. That is because you are not a real person to him. You are just a convenient distraction. And the second you become a problem, if you get pregnant or ask for more, or threaten his perfect image, if you are lucky, Eleanor will show up and offer you money to just go away. I am not like those other women. That is exactly what every single one of them thought, Meredith replied. She pushed the folder into Sloane's hands. You have to read every single page. Then you need to make a choice about whether you want to protect a man who let his own son die. Meredith then turned and began to walk away. She left Sloane standing on the sidewalk, clutching the folder to her chest as her whole world started to fall apart. 3 days later, Meredith's phone buzzed. I read everything, Sloane said, her voice sounding completely broken. I asked Garrett about it. He did not even bother to deny it. He just smiled at me and said I should be thankful that he chose me. So what will you do now? Meredith asked. A long silence hung between them on the phone. Then, in a very quiet voice, Sloane asked, What do you want me to do? Testify, Meredith said simply. Tell everyone what you saw that night. Tell them what Garrett said and how he ignored my calls. Eleanor will destroy me. My father's entire business will be ruined. Eleanor is going to ruin you no matter what you do, Meredith told her. Your only choice is if you want to be remembered as his victim or as his partner in crime. Another long pause came through the line. Meredith could hear Sloane breathing, feeling the difficult struggle she was going through. Okay, Sloane finally said. I will testify. With Sloane's help, the district attorney could reopen the case. This time, they had a witness with direct knowledge of what happened. Someone who had no reason to make up a story. Someone who had seen Garrett's cold-heartedness up close. Their lawyer, Richard Sullivan, called Meredith to his office. His voice was hopeful, but cautious. This changes everything, he explained. Sloane's testimony confirms every detail of your story. The district attorney is officially pressing charges. For one bright, shining moment, Meredith let herself feel hope. Garrett was arrested at his office the next week. Meredith watched from across the street as police officers led him out of the building in handcuffs. They walked him past the co-workers who once admired him, past the young assistants who were afraid of him, and past the security guards who always treated him with respect. His face showed no emotion, but Meredith could see the pure panic in his eyes. It felt like a true victory. But she should have known that it was not over. She should have known that Eleanor Lawson would never give up without using every single weapon she had. The hardest part of the fight was just beginning. Eleanor Lawson called for a press conference. It was held on the steps of the Massachusetts State House. Meredith watched it on television from her father's living room. Her father, William, sat next to her, his hand trembling as he held hers. The local news cut to a live feed. A huge crowd of reporters and cameras surrounded the silver-haired leader of one of Boston's most powerful families. I am speaking to you today, Eleanor began, her voice strong and confident, because my family has been targeted by a cruel campaign that is built on total lies. She held up a folder full of papers for the cameras to see. 27 years ago, William Sterling, who was a federal prosecutor at the time, put an innocent man in prison. Thomas Whitfield spent 8 years in jail for a murder he did not commit. He was convicted using evidence that William Sterling knew was false. Meredith felt her father go stiff beside her. I have statements in this folder from witnesses who were never called to testify and records of evidence that was intentionally hidden. This was all part of a corrupt system that ruined an innocent man's life. The reporters all started shouting questions at once. Eleanor raised a hand to silence them. William Sterling's daughter. Meredith Lawson is now going after my son as an act of personal revenge. She has faked evidence, she has paid people to lie, and she has made up this entire story because she cannot face the truth of her own child's death. Meredith felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Meredith Lawson chose to work extra shifts while her sick son was at home. She ignored her son's medical problems. She put her career before her own family, and now she is drowning in her own guilt and trying to put the blame on someone else. Eleanor's voice became cold and hard. I will not let my son be destroyed because of this woman's personal failures. I am giving these documents to the press, she announced. I am demanding a full investigation into William Sterling's entire career as a prosecutor, and I am asking the people of Massachusetts to see this for what it is. A desperate mother trying to escape her own responsibility. The press conference turned into chaos. Reporters screamed questions, and camera flashes went off everywhere. But Eleanor stood calmly in the middle of the storm, looking powerful and untouchable. Meredith turned off the television. Is any of it true? She asked her father. Her voice was almost a whisper. About that Whitfield case, William was silent for a very long time. When he finally answered, his voice was weak. Thomas Whitfield was a guilty man. I still believe that. But the evidence we used to convict him... He closed his eyes. There were problems. We should have shared information with his defense lawyers. I told myself it was okay, because I knew he did it. But now, Eleanor has the proof. Proof of what? I do not know for sure, but she has enough to make people doubt us. Enough to make this whole thing look like a personal attack instead of a fight for justice. The consequences were immediate and severe. Garrett was released on bail while the new accusations were investigated. The district attorney's office put the case on hold until the investigation into William's past was complete. The news stories stopped being about Garrett's crime and started being about William's. 3 days later, Meredith got a call. It was Richard Sullivan. I am so sorry, Meredith, he said. We have to drop the charges. Our evidence is still strong, but with these claims against your father, any jury would have reasonable doubt. Eleanor's lawyers will say this whole case was just a revenge plot. Meredith closed her eyes. So, he is getting away with it. Not forever, but we need new evidence, something that has nothing to do with your father, something that will make Eleanor's attacks meaningless. That night, Meredith sat in Lucas's empty room for the last time. She was now 7 months pregnant, and the baby was kicking constantly. It was a new life demanding to be noticed, even in a house so full of sadness. Her father was in the other room, recovering from a heart attack, his good name ruined. Garrett was a free man. Eleanor had won. Everything Meredith fought for had been turned into nothing. She picked up Captain the Elephant, her son's favorite toy, and held it to her face. She breathed in the faint, fading smell of her little boy. I do not know what to do now, my sweet boy, she whispered. They took everything from us. They won. But as she said those words, she felt something change inside of her. It was not the baby. It was something deeper and stronger. They had taken her son. They had taken her career. They had taken her friends, her marriage, her father's health, and all of her hope. What else could she possibly lose? She still had the truth. She still had her voice. And she had a fierce, angry determination not to be silenced. If the system would not give her justice, she would have to find it herself. She was determined to forge her own way forward. On a Tuesday night at midnight, Meredith posted her video online. She did not have professional equipment or a media consultant. She just sat in her son's bedroom, 7 months pregnant, clutching Captain the Elephant, and told the truth. My name is Meredith Lawson. 3 months ago, my 5-year-old son died from a heart condition while his father was with his mistress. She spoke for 23 minutes without stopping. She laid everything bare, the 17 missed calls, the canceled insurance policy, the gambling debts, the forged signatures, and the 3 other women who came before Sloane. She did not cry or ask for pity while recounting Brooke's deceit and Eleanor's schemes to hide her own father's mistakes. She presented the cold, hard facts, one document after another, one date after another, revealing one lie after the next. "I am not asking for your sympathy," she said, her eyes fixed on the camera. "I am asking you to see the truth. I want you to understand what happens when rich men face no consequences, when powerful families can buy silence, when the justice system looks the other way." She held up Captain, the little stuffed elephant that Lucas had loved so much. "Right before my son died, he called for his father," she continued, her voice steady. "His dad never came. His dad was in a hotel room with another woman. His dad saw my calls and chose to ignore them." She took a deep breath to steady herself. "If Garrett Lawson has ever hurt you, if Eleanor Lawson ever paid you to be quiet, if you know anything at all, I urge you to speak up. Do not do it for me, but for every woman who could be next. Do it for every child who deserves a father who actually cares." She shared the video on every social media site she could think of, and then she waited. By the next morning, the video had 200,000 views. By that afternoon, more than 1 million people had watched it. By the end of the day, it was a feature on the national news. In less than 48 hours, 4 more women found the courage to tell their stories. These were women Meredith had never met, women Eleanor had never even known about. For years, they had been silent, believing no one would believe them. Soon, there were 7 women, and then there were 12. Former employees at Whitmore Capital began leaking company documents. The records proved that the company knew all about Garrett's actions and had helped conceal them. Reporters, who had been silenced by Eleanor's legal team, suddenly found their courage. Witnesses who had taken money to keep quiet decided their conscience was more valuable than a check. The Federal Bureau of Investigation launched a probe into Eleanor's offshore bank accounts. The Internal Revenue Service started a deep dive into the Lawson family's finances. The Massachusetts State Bar Association began an investigation into the judges who had sided with Garrett. The district attorney was facing immense public pressure and had no choice but to refile the charges. Richard Sullivan called Meredith with news that almost made her buckle. "We have enough," he said. "Not just to prosecute Garrett, but to prosecute Eleanor, too. We are looking at obstruction of justice, bribery, money laundering, and witness tampering," he laid out. He paused for a moment. "This is going to trial." The trial went on for 3 entire weeks. Meredith was on the witness stand for a total of 6 hours across 2 days. She kept her composure as she answered every question the defense lawyers threw at her. She did not get angry when they tried to portray her as mentally unstable. She stayed calm when they implied she made up evidence. She simply looked at the jury and told them what had happened, clearly and truthfully. Sloane Whitmore testified, Nicole Brennan testified, 8 other women also took the stand. Former Whitmore Capital employees also testified. The defense attorneys claimed that Meredith was just a grieving mother out for revenge. The prosecution argued that the evidence against Garrett was undeniable. On the last day, the jury only needed 4 hours to reach a decision. They found Garrett Lawson guilty on all charges. The sentencing was held 2 weeks later. Meredith sat in the front row of the courtroom. Her father, looking frail but determined to be there, was right beside her. She was 8 months pregnant now, and the baby's kicks were a constant reminder that life goes on even in the middle of loss. Judge Patricia Winters read the sentence. "Mr. Lawson, you have been found guilty of forgery, wire fraud, money laundering, and several counts of conspiracy to commit financial fraud. You have systematically betrayed your wife, your family, your business partners, and the laws of this country." Garrett just stared at the floor. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his usual confident attitude was gone. This court sentences you to 12 years in a federal prison, to be followed by 5 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay back every dollar to those you have defrauded. Your professional licenses are hereby permanently revoked. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. Eleanor Lawson was convicted in her own trial and received a sentence of 8 years, while the government seized all her assets. Meredith watched as they were both led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. She expected to feel victorious, or maybe a sense of relief. Instead, all she felt was a profound weariness, a heavy sorrow, and a void that she knew would probably never disappear. But beneath it all, there was a feeling that was close to peace. 6 months after the trial, Meredith stood in a small memorial garden on the edge of Boston. The garden was created with the settlement money from Whitmore Capital, which paid millions to settle a civil case it was certain to lose. Every single penny of that settlement was used to build this garden. It was created as a peaceful sanctuary for families who had lost a child. It stood as a living monument to the little boy whose death brought down a corrupt empire. The Lucas Sterling Lawson Memorial Garden. Spring had finally arrived, feeling soft and hopeful after a long, hard winter. Flowers were starting to bloom in neat rows of tulips, daffodils, and crocuses, pushing through the soil that still held the memory of the cold. A small fountain bubbled peacefully in the center of the garden, and benches were placed for visitors to sit, think, grieve, and find hope. Meredith followed a winding path to a peaceful corner where a small oak tree had been planted for Lucas. The young tree was barely taller than she was, its new green leaves just starting to open in the warm air. She held her daughter in her arms. Charlotte was 3 months old. She had her father's dark hair and her grandmother's blue eyes, the very same eyes Lucas once had. At times, looking at her was like seeing a sweet ghost. She was a beautiful reminder of all that Meredith had lost, but also of all that she still had. She knelt on the soft grass, being careful with the sleeping baby. She placed a single white rose beside the brass plaque at the base of the tree. The marker read, Lucas James Lawson, 5 years of joy, forever in our hearts. I wanted you to meet your little sister, my sweet boy, she whispered. Her name is Charlotte. I did not name her after anyone. I wanted her to have a name that was entirely her own, with no history or sadness attached to it. Charlotte began to stir in her arms, making soft, sleepy sounds. Meredith rocked her gently. Your grandpa is here, too. He is getting stronger, but he moves a lot slower now. He needs a cane to walk, but he is still the same fighter he always was. I think he will always be a fighter. She looked up at the little tree, its tiny branches, stretching for the sun. They are in prison now. Both of them, your father and your grandmother. They will be there for a very long time. I do not know if that makes things right. Nothing can ever make this truly right. But at least they can never hurt anyone else again. She heard a footstep on the grass behind her. Turning her head, she saw William walking toward her, leaning on his cane. He looked older than his 68 years. The trial had taken a huge toll on him, and the heart attack had left him weaker, but he was there. He was alive, and he was with her. It is a beautiful day, he said, as he carefully sat down on the bench by the tree. Yes, it is, she replied. He sat for a quiet moment, just watching his daughter and his new granddaughter in the soft afternoon sunlight. I heard from the foundation this morning, he finally said. They want you to speak at the national conference next month. They want you to share your story with doctors, lawmakers, and other families. You could help them understand what is truly at risk when people lose their health insurance. Meredith considered it for a moment. 6 months ago, She could never have imagined speaking about any of this to a room full of people, models. She had done it more times than she could count. Over 40 million people had watched her video. Her words had helped change the laws. Her journey gave other women the courage to tell their own stories and inspired families not to give up their own fights. "I will think about it," she finally said. Her father nodded. A reporter from the Boston Globe called too. She wants to write a book about everything, to share the whole story of what we all went through. "And what did you say to her?" Meredith asked. "I told her that it is your story to tell, not mine." Meredith glanced down at Charlotte, who was now awake, her big, curious eyes staring right up at her mother. She was so small, so perfect, completely unaware of the storm that had raged right before she was born. "Do you have any regrets about all of it?" William asked gently. "The fight, being in the spotlight, everything we had to give up." Meredith took a moment to truly consider his question. "I regret that Lucas is gone," she said at last. "I regret not seeing who Garrett really was much, much sooner. I regret that I ever trusted Brooke. And I regret every single day with my son that I will never get back." She paused, watching a butterfly float by and land on the rose she had placed for Lucas. "But do I regret the fight? The attention? No, I do not regret that part at all. Lucas deserved a better father than one who would just let him die. The women Garrett hurt deserve to have their voices heard. And the families that come after us deserve to know the truth." She stood up, still cradling Charlotte, and looked straight at her father. "They expected my sadness to break me. They thought their money and their power would buy my silence. They thought I was weak because I loved with my whole heart and trusted too easily." A real smile, the first one in a very long time, spread across her face. They were very, very wrong. William stood up from the bench and moved to her side. They stood there for a moment, looking at the small oak tree that was planted for Lucas. It was still young, but it was growing, always reaching for the sunlight. "So what comes next for us?" he asked. Meredith kissed Charlotte on the forehead, taking in the sweet, clean smell of her baby hair. "Now we begin to live again. We will always remember Lucas. We will raise Charlotte. And we will help other families so they never have to experience what we did." She turned and started walking toward the garden exit, her father beside her and her daughter safe in her arms. The warm spring sun shone down on her, and birds sang from the branches above. Life was moving on, just as it always does, carrying both the weight of sorrow and the bright hope of a new beginning. At the edge of the garden, she stopped and looked back one last time at the little oak tree, its branches stretching up to the sky. "I will never be completely whole again," she said softly. "A part of me will always be broken, but I am still standing, and I made sure the man who let my son die will lose his best years in a prison cell, thinking about everything he threw away." She took a long, slow breath. "Some people might see that as revenge. I see it as justice." She walked through the gates and into the sunlight, carrying her daughter toward whatever the future held. Behind them, Lucas's tree stood tall and strong against the bright blue sky. A soft breeze rustled its leaves, making them whisper. With every day that went by, its roots dug deeper into the earth and grew stronger, just like the love of the mother who planted it there.